Imagine you have spent your entire life living in a pitch black cave.
Right, like absolute total dark.
Yeah, total darkness. You've never seen the sky. You've never seen a fire. You have never even seen a candle.
Okay, setting the scene.
And one day you are crawling around in the dark and you find a dirty, smudged gray rock.
Just a basic piece of rubble.
Spot on, just a piece of rubble. But because it is the lightest thing you have ever encountered in this pitch black environment, your eyes adjust to it.
Oh, I see where this is going.
You spend years marveling at this rock, right? You become convinced it is the brightest, purest white object in the entire universe.
Because you literally have no other frame of reference.
Precise. So what happens to your mind and, your vision when someone finally drags you outside that cave and forces you to stare directly into the midday sun?
You would be completely blinded.
Yeah, it would be a shock to the system. Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today we are unpacking a framework that takes a sledgehammer to the way modern society tells us to view ourselves.
It really does. It shatters the whole modern paradigm.
It does. We are looking at some historical excerpts from John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, and we are focusing on the intricate two-way relationship between knowing God and knowing ourselves. So this is a deep dive tailored specifically for you, the listener, if you want to gain this knowledge quickly but thoroughly.
And it is a framework that completely upends our modern instincts.
How so?
Well, if you look at the self-help industry today, or psychology, or even just general cultural advice, the reflex is to treat self-knowledge as a closed loop.
Like looking inward.
Yeah. The idea is that if you want to understand who you are, you have to look inward. You take personality tests, you go on solitary retreats, you sit in quiet rooms.
Right. You try to isolate your mind to figure out your true identity.
Spot on. But the source material we are examining today argues the complete opposite.
It really does not pull any punches.
No, it does not. It opens with the claim that true, sound wisdom consists of only two interconnected parts.
Just two.
Just two. The knowledge of God and the knowledge of ourselves.
On the surface, that sounds like a fairly simple categorization.
It does sound simple at first glance.
But then you get to the core tension of the text. It introduces this massive chicken or the egg scenario.
Right. Which of these two types of knowledge comes first?
Yeah, how does one trigger the other? I mean, can you ever actually know yourself without knowing God, or vice versa?
That is the central problem the text wrestles with.
It is a huge question.
It is. These two types of knowledge are joined by so many bonds that discerning which one precedes the other is incredibly difficult.
Like untangling a massive knot.
Yeah, a huge knot. But to grasp what wisdom actually is, the writer argues we have to start by looking at the undeniable reality of our own human condition.
We have to start with what we possess.
We do. And that observation, interestingly enough, forces an upward gaze.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of that upward gaze, because the text makes a jarring point right out of the gate.
It really is jarring.
It states that no one can look upon himself without immediately turning his thoughts to the contemplation of God.
Which is a bold claim.
Extremely bold.
Yeah.
It implies that true self-reflection is impossible without your thoughts naturally bouncing upward.
Bouncing up toward a creator, yeah.
But if I am just sitting here taking inventory of my own life, my career, my skills, my family, why does that automatically force my brain to think about a divine creator?
Well, it comes down to the origin of your attributes.
What do you mean by that?
When you take that inventory, you notice your intellect, your physical abilities, your talents.
The things I am good at.
Yeah, the things you excel at. The text refers to these as our mighty gifts.
Mighty gifts, okay?
But a moment of honest reflection reveals a stark reality. You did not invent those gifts.
I mean, I worked hard for my degree, but I did not invent the brain that got the degree.
That is the point. You did not conjure your own intellect out of thin air. Your very existence is a subsistence in the one God.
Okay, subsistence. That is a heavy philosophical concept.
It is a bit weighty, yes.
I want to make sure we are not just using dictionary definitions here.
Sure, let's ground it.
Think of subsistence like a desktop computer that doesn't have an internal battery.
Okay, I am with you.
It is plugged directly into the wall socket. As long as the electricity flows, the screen is bright, the processor runs, the fans spin.
It looks like it has a life of its own.
Right. But the second you pull the plug, the entire machine goes dead instantly.
It has no independent life.
Zero. It doesn't generate its own energy. It is just drawing it continuously from an external source.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it.
The text actually uses a reference from the book of Acts, noting that in him we live and move.
Meaning our basic ability to take a single breath is like that computer drawing electricity.
Yeah, it is all borrowed energy.
Because we're not generating our own life force, observing our own existence naturally forces a logical mind to look for the origin point of the electricity.
You have to follow the cord to the wall.
Spot on. And the text provides a very vivid, natural image to illustrate this mechanism.
The dew analogy.
Yeah, it compares the benefits we receive in life to dew falling from heaven.
I love that analogy. If you are walking through a dry, barren field at dawn, and suddenly your boots are soaked with dew on the grass, you know the moisture did not spontaneously generate from the dead dirt.
It had to come from the atmosphere.
Right, it came from above.
The writer takes that imagery a step further, comparing these benefits to rivulets that lead us to the spring itself.
Like little streams of water.
Yeah, if you are hiking in the woods and you stumble across a rivulet, a tiny, trickling stream of fresh water, your logical conclusion is not that the water just materialized out of the rocks.
That would defy physics.
It would. The stream implies a source. If you follow that little stream, it leads you to a larger river, and eventually it guides you all the way up the mountain to the spring.
The spring is the source of the water, just like God is the source of the mighty gifts.
That is the connection the text makes, yeah.
So when you look at the good things in your own life, those are the rivulets.
Tracing them backward naturally leads you up the mountain.
You start by looking at yourself, but the undeniable evidence of the water forces you to look at the peak.
That is the first mechanism. Our gifts point upward.
Okay, but the text does not stop there, does it?
No, it shifts gears dramatically here.
How so?
It argues that it is not just our gifts and benefits that point us to God. There is something else that does an even more effective job of disclosing the infinitude of benefits reposing in God.
And what is that?
Our absolute poverty.
Okay, the text actually says, indeed, our very poverty better discloses the infinitude of benefits.
Which is incredibly counterintuitive.
It really is. You would naturally assume the good things point to the good source.
Like a beautiful painting points to a talented painter.
Yeah, but here the argument is that the lack of good things, the brokenness, is what really throws the spotlight on the spring.
It requires understanding the specific theological context the writer is operating within.
Right.
The text speaks of a miserable ruin into which the rebellion of the first man cast us.
A miserable ruin.
Yes. This framework does not view humans as empty vessels waiting to be filled up with knowledge.
It views us as ruined structures.
We are devastated, according to this text.
The vocabulary used to describe this ruin is intense.
Very graphic.
It talks about mankind being a veritable world of miseries. It says we are despoiled of divine raiment, leaving our shameful nakedness to expose a teeming horde of infamies.
A teeming horde of infamies.
That sounds like an infestation of insects under a rotten log.
It is a graphic depiction of total depravity.
It paints a bleak picture.
The idea is that humanity has been stripped of its glorious original clothing, the divine raiment, and is left shivering, exposed, and utterly corrupted.
But wait, I have a hard time with that phrasing.
What part?
If I look at human history, sure, I see war and famine and ruin, but I also see incredible things.
That is true.
I see doctors dedicating their lives to curing diseases. I see beautiful symphonies. I see parents sacrificing everything for their children.
Acts of genuine good.
Yeah. If we are just a teeming horde of infamies, how does this framework account for any human goodness? Why don't we just see absolute evil all the time?
That is a crucial distinction to make. Calling humanity a ruin does not mean humans are incapable of anything good or beautiful.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Think of a ruined mansion.
Like an old abandoned estate.
Yeah, if you walk through a collapsed abandoned estate, you might still see gorgeous marble columns, intricate tile work on the floor, and a beautiful grand staircase.
Right, you can recognize the brilliance of the original architect.
Spot on. But the roof has caved in, the windows are shattered, and weeds are growing through the floorboards.
It is falling apart.
The presence of the beautiful marble columns does not change the fact that the house is fundamentally uninhabitable.
It is still a ruin.
It is a ruin. The symphonies and the medical advancements you mentioned are the beautiful columns, remnants of the original design, but the structure itself is fundamentally compromised by the infamies.
Oh, I see. So the beauty we do see just highlights the tragedy of the collapse.
That is a great way to put it.
And the text notes that this miserable ruin produces a specific psychological reaction.
It does.
It says we are stung by the consciousness of our own unhappiness. We experience fasting and hungering.
Yes. The ruin is not a comfortable place to live.
Obviously not.
Through the fear and the hunger that the ruin produces, we learn humility.
But look, if I am listening to this deep dive right now, my first instinct is to wonder about the psychological toll of this.
It sounds depressing.
Yeah, doesn't dwelling on my own depravity and nakedness just lead to despair?
A lot of people ask that.
If I look in the mirror and genuinely see a ruin, my instinct is to give up. I don't naturally want to seek a higher being, I just want to hide.
Sure.
How does acknowledging our misery act as a catalyst rather than a crushing weight?
Because of the contrast it creates in your mind.
The contrast.
The text argues that from the feeling of our own ignorance, vanity, poverty, infirmity, and depravity, we recognize something outside of ourselves.
We realize we lack something.
We realize that the tree light of wisdom, sound virtue, full abundance of every good, and purity of righteousness rest in the Lord alone.
Ah, the fasting and hungering.
Yeah, think about the physical sensation of hunger.
If you eat junk food all day, you never crave a nutritious meal. Your stomach feels full, even though you are malnourished.
You are technically starving for nutrients, but you feel fine.
But when you are truly starving, when your stomach is empty and cramping, you don't just sit there and think about the emptiness.
The pain of the hunger forces your brain to obsess over food.
You seek thence what you lack. The misery itself creates the appetite.
That is it. The dissatisfaction is a mandatory psychological step.
The text makes that pretty clear.
The writer makes it explicitly clear. We cannot seriously aspire to him before we begin to become displeased with ourselves.
You have to feel the sting of the illness before you are motivated to search for the cure.
If you think you are healthy, you never make an appointment with a doctor.
You have to feel the pain, notice the symptom, recognize the infirmity.
The text says we are prompted by our own ills to contemplate the good things of God.
Which highlights a tremendous danger discussed in the text.
Yes, the danger of ignorance.
The source material asks, what man in all the world would not gladly remain as he is, so long as he does not know himself?
If a person is content with their own gifts and ignorant of their own misery, they stagnate.
They never move. It is the comfort of ignorance.
Going back to the ruined mansion, if you don't realize it is a ruin, you might think you're living in a palace.
You arrange the rubble, you sweep the dirt into a neat pile, you set up a little chair in the corner of a collapsed room, and you tell yourself everything is fine.
And because you are content playing in the rubble, you never look for a better home.
Now never look up.
That artificial contentment is the ultimate trap. Recognizing your miserable state is the only thing that breaks the illusion.
It is the only way out.
The text concludes this first dynamic by saying that the knowledge of ourselves not only arouses us to seek God, but also leads us by the hand to find him.
It takes us by the hand. The realization of our poverty is not designed to grind us into the dirt.
No, it is a mechanism designed to pull us toward the only place where true light and sound virtue exist.
Okay, but as we move into the second phase of the source material, we encounter a massive problem.
A huge roadblock.
Attempting to look at our misery in isolation, trying to gain self-knowledge without first looking at God, has a fatal flaw.
Human beings have a built-in psychological defense mechanism that prevents us from evaluating our own ruin accurately.
This is where the framework gets fascinating.
It really is.
Because if we just sit around trying to evaluate our own misery, we almost always end up making excuses for ourselves.
We convince ourselves the ruin isn't that bad.
Right. So the text flips the equation entirely. Knowing ourselves is literally impossible without first gazing at the divine standard.
The writer identifies this defense mechanism as an innate trap of pride.
An innate trap.
The text states plainly that man never achieves a clear knowledge of himself unless he has first looked upon God's face and then descends from contemplating him to scrutinize himself.
You have to look up before you can look down.
Why? Because the text points out that we always seem to ourselves righteous and upright and wise and holy.
It calls this pride innate in all of us.
We come out of the womb with a default operating system that constantly whispers, "You are doing a great job."
We are inclined by nature to hypocrisy.
The argument here is that unless we stand convinced by clear, undeniable proofs of our own unrighteousness, foulness, folly, and impurity, we will just keep believing we are the heroes of our own story.
And we are never convinced of our foulness if we only use ourselves as the standard of measurement.
We need an objective standard.
The text insists the Lord is the sole standard by which this judgment must be measured.
And this leads to an analogy in the source material that absolutely shatters the way we evaluate our own morality.
This is the concept of the dirty white object.
This is one of the most brilliant visual explanations of human hypocrisy in the text.
Let's break down the optics of how this works in the human mind because it is so insightful.
Yeah, let's look at the mechanics of it.
We talked about this a bit in the intro with the cave. Imagine an eye to which nothing is shown but black objects.
A completely dark space.
Right. You are in a room painted charcoal black, the furniture is black, the lighting is incredibly dim.
Okay, I am picturing it.
Then someone places an object on the table that is a mottled, dirty, smudged gray-white.
Just a filthy rag, basically.
Yeah. Because your only frame of reference is pitch black, your eye evaluates that dirty white object and judges it to be absolute pure whiteness.
It looks brilliant.
Simply because of the contrast.
The text takes this optical illusion and applies it directly to our moral and spiritual vision.
How does that map onto our daily lives?
Because nothing appears within or around us that has not been contaminated by great immorality. What is a little less vile pleases us as a thing most pure.
We confine our minds within the limits of human corruption.
We restrict our standard of measurement to a horizontal plane.
A horizontal plane. Think about how this plays out in modern society. Think about social media.
Oh, social media is the perfect example of this.
Why do we love curating feeds that show extreme behavior or terrible influencers or people making awful choices?
It makes us feel better about ourselves.
I think it is about control. We manufacture a dark room.
We surround ourselves with digital examples of pitch black behavior.
Exactly, so that when we yell at someone in traffic or act selfishly at work, we can look at our own dirty white morality and say, well, at least I am not as bad as that guy on the internet.
We use other corrupted people as our measuring stick.
And as a result, we are abundantly satisfied with our own empty image of righteousness.
We are grading on a curve.
A very forgiving curve.
But the entire curve is contaminated. We judge a slightly lesser evil as something to be praised.
And as long as we keep our frame of reference horizontal looking only at the other people around us, we will always fall victim to this innate pride.
We will always think our dirty white object is pure.
So to break the illusion, we need a different light source.
We have to shatter the horizontal curve.
The text provides another visceral metaphor here, moving from colors to our physical senses, specifically staring at the sun.
The sun analogy beautifully illustrates how our self-estimation collapses when introduced to a true standard.
Let's talk about that. The text asks us to think about how we evaluate our eyesight in broad daylight.
Okay, so if you are standing outside, looking down at the ground, surveying the trees and the buildings,
you feel like you have perfect vision.
you can see the pebbles on the dirt path.
You can see the veins on a leaf.
You seem to yourself endowed with the keenest, strongest sight possible.
But then you change the direction of your gaze.
You look up.
You look up and gaze straight into the midday sun.
Suddenly, that exact same power of sight that felt so flawless a moment ago is blunted and confused by a great brilliance.
You are blinded.
Your eyes water, you have to look away, and all you see are spots.
Why does it hurt? Because the human eye is not built to take in that level of unshielded glory.
And the physical conclusion you are forced to admit is that your keenness in looking upon earthly things is actually sheer dullness when it comes to the sun.
Your vision is not as strong as you thought.
The writer then applies this physical reality directly to how we estimate our spiritual goods.
As long as we do not look beyond the earth, as long as we keep our vision horizontal, we flatter ourselves most sweetly.
We are entirely content with our own righteousness, our own wisdom, our own virtue.
The text says we fancy ourselves all but demigods.
Demigods. It is a crazy term to use, but it is accurate.
We look at our little acts of charity, our small moments of cleverness, our ability to hold down a job, and we think we are superhuman.
We are staring at pebbles on the ground and bragging about our flawless vision.
But suppose we begin to raise our thoughts to God.
Suppose we ponder his nature and how completely perfect his righteousness, wisdom, and might are.
The text calls this absolute perfection the straight edge to which we must be shaped.
A straight edge.
Yeah, a straight edge. If you try to draw a straight line on a piece of paper freehand, it might look pretty straight to you.
You might hold it up next to your friend's wobbly freehand line and think, I did a great job. I am an artist.
But the second you lay a metal straight edge next to your line, the illusion dies.
You see every wobble, every slight deviation, every crooked mark.
The vocabulary the text uses to describe what happens when we hit the divine straight edge is jarring.
It doesn't hold back.
When we measure ourselves against absolute perfection, what masqueraded earlier as righteousness in us will suddenly grow filthy in its consummate wickedness.
Filthy. It doesn't say it looks slightly flawed.
It says it grows filthy.
Hmm.
And what wonderfully impressed us under the name of wisdom will stink in its very foolishness.
Our human wisdom literally stinks when compared to the source.
And what wore the face of strength will prove itself the most miserable weakness.
The contrast is absolute. What in us seems perfection itself corresponds ill to the purity of God.
The dirty white object is finally dragged out of the dark room and held up against true whiteness.
And we finally realize how dark and mottled it truly is.
So what actually happens to a human being when that broken measuring stick is taken away and they are exposed to the blinding sun of a pure standard?
Do they just politely adjust their self-esteem, shrug their shoulders,
Yeah.
and try to do better tomorrow?
Right. What is the reaction? The source material shows that the reaction is not a quiet academic adjustment.
The reaction is violent.
It is an overwhelming response.
The encounter with absolute majesty produces a visceral, overwhelming psychological collapse. This brings us to the profound destruction of human pride.
The text points out the reaction of the saints in Scripture. It specifically highlights the dread and wonder they experience.
Whenever these towering figures of faith felt the presence of God, they were stricken and overcome.
The writer notes a fascinating contrast in human behavior.
He describes men who, in the normal course of life, remained firm and constant.
These were not fragile people. They were stable, strong leaders.
But when God manifests his glory, these same firm and constant men are shaken and struck dumb.
They are laid low by the dread of death.
The text says they are in fact overwhelmed by it and almost annihilated.
Annihilated, reduced to ash.
To ensure the reader grasps the weight of this reaction, the source material lists specific examples of this consternation.
This is not an isolated phenomenon.
No, it is a repeated, verifiable pattern across biblical history.
Let's examine those examples because the context is staggering.
The text mentions a common cry found in the book of Judges and in the prophets.
The expression was frequent among the people. We shall die, for the Lord has appeared to us.
Their immediate instinctual assumption upon encountering pure majesty was that their own impure existence would be extinguished on the spot.
Just wiped out.
Then there's the example of Abraham. The text references Genesis 18.
Right.
It notes how Abraham recognizes more clearly that he is earth and dust when once he had come nearer to beholding God's glory.
Earth and dust.
Think about the cultural context of Abraham.
He was a patriarch, a wealthy, powerful man with armies and vast resources.
He was respected by kings.
But when he gets close to the glory, his entire paradigm shifts.
He recognizes his composition is just dirt.
He links himself right back to the creation narrative, acknowledging he is nothing but animated soil.
He has zero illusions about his own status.
The text also points to the prophet Elijah. In 1 Kings 19, Elijah is described as being unable to bear the awesomeness of God's appearance.
He must cover his face.
He physically cannot look upon it.
It is the sun analogy playing out in real life.
The brilliance is so blunting, so overwhelming, that he has to shield his eyes to survive the encounter.
And then the text brings in the book of Job, which is entirely centered on this dynamic.
Job's narrative provides a powerful psychological argument.
The text notes that Job's description of God's wisdom, power, and purity always expresses an argument that overwhelms men with the realization of their own stupidity, impotence, and corruption.
Stupidity and impotence.
Again, the text is completely dismantling the demigod illusion.
Job was a righteous man, the best of the best in his era.
But when the straight edge is applied, he realizes he can do nothing and knows nothing.
The source material asks a very pointed question based on Job's narrative. And what can man do who is rottenness itself and a worm?
Rottenness and a worm.
This vivid imagery strips away every single layer of the divine raiment we pretend to wear.
It forces an agonizing acknowledgement of the miserable ruin we discussed earlier.
But the writer pushes the concept even further. He doesn't stop at human inadequacy.
He scales it up.
He expands this into a concept of cosmic humility. He references the prophet Isaiah, and the imagery here scales the problem to the entire universe.
The text asks, what can a man, a worm, do when even the very cherubim must veil their faces out of fear?
The cherubim, these are celestial beings.
Creatures of immense strength and purity, entirely uncorrupted by human sin.
Yet even they cannot stand unveiled before the majesty of the Creator.
And the text quotes Isaiah 24. The sun will blush and the moon be confounded when the Lord of hosts shall reign.
The sun will blush.
Think about that.
The brightest object in our physical sky, the nuclear furnace that we cannot even look at without destroying our optic nerves, will be embarrassed by its own dimness when the absolute splendor is revealed.
The text says the brightest thing we know will become darkness before it.
It is the ultimate application of the straight edge.
If the literal sun is darkness compared to this majesty, where does that leave human self-estimation?
That is the question that should haunt us.
It really should.
If pure celestial beings and the literal sun and moon are overshadowed by this brilliance, what does that say about our daily, exhausting attempts to justify our own tiny, dirty, white righteousness?
We spend so much mental energy arguing that we are good people.
We do. We argue that we voted for the right politician, that we handled a conflict at work better than our coworker.
We are so desperate to prove our own worth,
The text used this cosmic scale to cement its core thesis.
which is that man is never sufficiently touched and affected by the awareness of his lowly state until he's compared himself directly with God's majesty.
You can compare yourself to your neighbor, you can compare yourself to a criminal, you can even compare yourself to the sun.
But until you compare yourself to the absolute perfection of the Lord, you will not be sufficiently touched by the awareness of your actual state.
You will just keep walking around your dark room, wearing your dirty white shirt, fully convinced you are gleaming.
Which leads us to the final structural conclusion of the text.
Having established that these two parts of wisdom, the knowledge of God and the knowledge of self, are inextricably linked, the writer leaves us with a specific rule for how we must approach learning.
The pedagogical conclusion.
The text says that however these two types of knowledge may be mutually connected, the order of right teaching requires a specific sequence.
The text mandates that we must discuss the knowledge of God first, and then proceed afterward to treat the knowledge of ourselves.
The sequence matters.
It matters a lot.
Even though you cannot look at yourself without your thoughts bouncing up to God, and you cannot know yourself accurately without the divine straight edge, when it comes to actively pursuing wisdom, you have to start with the straight edge.
Let's synthesize everything we have covered to understand why this order is mandatory.
Okay, let's pull it all together.
You cannot measure a crooked line without first drawing a perfectly straight one.
If you start by trying to measure a crooked line with another crooked line, you generate bad data.
You just end up feeding your innate pride.
You have to look at the sun before you can realize your sight on Earth is actually sheer dullness.
If you start by looking at the earth, the defense mechanism kicks in, and you conclude you are a demigod.
The order of right teaching is a safeguard.
By establishing the pure standard of majesty first, any subsequent examination of your own soul is protected from the illusion of the dirty white object.
It forces you to see the ruined mansion for what it is.
And paradoxically, as we discovered early in the discussion, seeing the ruin, feeling the poverty, and acknowledging the hunger is the very catalyst that leads us by the hand to find the cure.
It creates a complete circuit of wisdom, but the entry point into the circuit must be the contemplation of the divine.
It is brilliant, to be honest.
We have covered incredible ground today in this deep dive.
We really have.
We started with the realization that every breath we take is a rivulet pointing to a spring.
We saw how the miserable ruin of human nature causes a hunger that drives us to seek an external cure.
We exposed the optical illusion of human hypocrisy, where we mistake dirty white for purity because we lock ourselves in a room of corrupted comparisons.
We looked at the sheer terror and annihilation of the greatest biblical saints when they encountered the true straight edge, realizing they were dust and worms in the presence of a majesty that makes the sun blush.
And we concluded that recognizing our poverty is not a reason for despair, but the only valid starting point for attaining true abundance.
It dismantles human pride down to the bedrock, but it replaces it with a truth that is infinitely more stable.
It strips away everything false. I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you step back into your daily routine.
A parting question.
Next time you feel completely secure in your own rightness in an argument or entirely justified in a decision you made, pause and ask yourself a question.
What is your standard?
Are you comparing your actions to the flawed people around you, settling comfortably for a dirty white standard?
Or are you willing to drag your justifications out of the dark room and hold them up to the blinding brilliance of the sun?
Have a great day and keep seeking true wisdom.